you everyone for being here this afternoon, and I hope all of you got to hear our keynote speaker speak at lunch, Greg Smoke. Very provocative presentation. To some degree, this session has a takeoff from what we heard from Greg. You will see, you will feel it, see it, hear it as we move forward. This is the 1:30 to 3:30 session, and it is part of the Utah Division of State History Annual Conference 2022, entitled Water at the Conference of Past and Future. Today, this afternoon, this panel will be addressing Bernard DeVoto's life and legacy at 125 years. So welcome to the afternoon session. Glad you could join us. The panel presentation is part of a year-long, let's see, I do this? Yes. Bottom arrow. Oh, wait a minute. There you go. Thank you. This panel presentation is part of a year-long celebration highlighting Bernard DeVoto's 125th anniversary since his birth in Ogden, Utah in 1897. January 11th, to be exact. A committee of very active and creative historians, writers, and interested parties have worked for the past 2.5 years under the leadership of Weber State University professor Scott Greenwell. Where are you, Scott? There he is. To spotlight Bernard's DeVoto's accomplishments as an essayist, thank you, literary critic, journalist, and historian. The goal is to reintroduce Bernard DeVoto into the discussion of the issues of the West. His writings of the 1930s, the 40s, and the 1950s are very relevant to today's discussion on water and politics and public lands in America. The members of this panel made up much of the committee, as you see there on the slide. A special thanks to those of you who are here today and to those who couldn't be here but participated in the effort to bring Bernard A. DeVoto back to the public awareness. So we will start with, on our series of panelists, with Professor Kathryn L. MacKay, followed by Professor Russell Burrows, then Professor David R. Lewis, Professor Jeff Nichols, and finally, Chief Acquiring Editor of the University of Utah Press, Jed Rogers. So, without further ado, Kathryn holds the title of Emeritus Professor of History at Weber State University, where she taught or is finishing teaching for 34 years. She also taught there, in addition to the history program, the honors program, the women and gender study program, and economics. She tells me she's currently teaching 2 final classes at Weber State, one on the history of U.S. economics and the second on American Indian history. We will, she also currently serves on 2 boards, Utah Humanities and Utah Historical Quarterly. I would like to go through and introduce everybody, and then we will just roll through it, hoping to be efficient. Our second presenter is Professor Russell Burrows. Russell is a professor of English at Weber State University, where he teaches American and American West literature, Shakespeare, and world literature. He has written on such Western American writers as Ed Abbey, Wallace Stegner, Cormac McCarty. Those of you who are fans of Cormac, he has a new book out almost this week, I believe. And of course, Bernard DeVoto. He will be followed by Professor David R. Lewis. David holds the title of Emeritus Professor at Utah State University, where he taught U.S. history, American West history, Utah history, environmental history, and American Indian history. From 2003 through 2015, David served as associate editor, co-editor, and editor of the Western History Quarterly. If you work in the field of Western history, as most of you, I suspect, do in this room, you know of David and his enormous influence on the study in this field. David is responsible for successfully assembling this panel and convincing the appropriate people at Utah State History Conference Board to include us in the program. We thank you, David. Professor Jeff Nichols holds the position of Professor of History at Westminster College, where he teaches United States history, Latin American culture and history, and environmental history. He also teaches a summer workshop that is to die for, were you to happen to get included. It is the most wonderful experience in exposing the American West to students and friends of Westminster College. And then finally, I got everybody. Jed Rogers, most of you will know him as the person who held the title of Senior State Historian and co-editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly. Well, that was true until a couple of weeks ago, when he has moved and accepted an offer as the acquiring editor for the University of Utah Press. Jed is an environmental and public historian of modern America with interests in the intersection of land, culture, and religion in Utah and the West. With that, our speakers have about 10 minutes per shot, and somebody is keeping track, did I hear, or should I? I will do that. I'll be flag man. And we want to thank our panel and thank you for being here. And with that, Kathryn, the podium is yours.
All right, thank you. Somebody tell me how to work this.
I will give you the signal for
please.
Keeping track of time.
Oh, well, my task. Oh, great. Okay, great. My task is to give a biography of this wonderful writer. And I take note of Greg Smith's comment about being a provocateur, because DeVoto was very much that. And the connection with water was that his last major essays and activities were all about saving Dinosaur National Park from intrusion to build dams. All right. So, Julian Bernard DeVoto was born in Missouri in 1860. His father was the son of a Piedmontese cavalry officer who had come to America to avoid the hostility of an aristocratic Roman family whose daughter he had married. That's a quote from the Standard Examiner. At age 17, he came to Ogden and taught at a Catholic school established by Father Lawrence Scanlon. He'd come to Utah Territory in 1873. Father Scanlon had a 42-year career in Utah, during which time he established churches, hospitals, and schools. The common school at which Florian taught was replaced in 1878 by the Sacred Heart Academy, and the Sisters of the Holy Cross were recruited from Notre Dame to be the teachers. Florian remained in Ogden, however, eventually going to work for the county recorder. In 1895, he married Rhoda Dye DeWolf, a widow with a son. Rhoda was born in New York in 1860. Soon afterwards, she traveled to Utah with her parents as part of a morning gathering. The Dyes settled on a farm in the winter just south of Ogden. Bernard Augustine was born to Florian and Rhoda in 1897. As a 1938 article in the Ogden Standard Examiner explained, two bloods warred in the veins of their son, two traditions warred in his mind. Bernard was neither Latin nor Saxon, neither Catholic nor Mormon. His education was begun in a church school and continued in public schools. His childhood oscillated between the poles of Rome and Deseret, and he found stability and healing to neither. Florian eventually became an abstractor and headed his own firm. Florian was an omnivorous reader. He spent a great deal of time in the Burrows bookstore, where he bought several of the Bone literary classics and English series, which included most of the world's great literature. Bernard himself later clerked in that bookstore. Florian conveyed his love of reading to his son. Bernard spent his early school years at the Sacred Heart Academy. He graduated from the 8th grade at Madison School the year before he broke his nose. When he collided head-on with another boy while running, the nose was not set correctly and was continuing annoyance to him. When he was younger, he spent his summers in his grandfather's farm in the winter. Later, he drove a delivery wagon, handled freight, was a baggage agent. You can tell that Ogden was a railroad town. I'm going to skip over quite a bit. He did go to Ogden High School, was known as a lover of writing. He organized an amateur press club. He wrote for the drama club. In his senior year, he reported baseball games for the Ogden Standard Examiner. In 1914, Bernard entered the University of Utah, however, got caught up in a controversy over academic freedom and ended up going to Harvard. World War I interrupted his studies. He enlisted in the Army and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He served as a small arms instructor stateside. Later, he served as a chaplain in the American Legion. In 1919, DeVoto came back to Ogden to care for his mother, who was dying in the flu epidemic. While there, he organized a branch of the Drama League of Americans to bring to Ogden lectures and musicians. This is the story of Bernard's life, is that he's always organizing something or other. DeVoto graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard in 1920 with a degree in philosophy as part of the class in 1918. He comes back to Ogden. He teaches school in Ogden, although there was some concern about his radicalness. Much of the time he spent knocking about in the West, tracing old trails of fur traders and settlers. 1 year after he was working on a ranch in Raft River Valley of Idaho, he was offered an instructorship in English at Northwestern University. There in 1924, he published his first novel, The Crooked Mile, set in his hometown of Ogden. While at Northwestern, DeVoto met Ellen Amos McVicker. This is their marriage certificate, the brightest co-ed in his freshman composition class. They married in 1923. The DeVoto's remained in Evanston for 4 years and then moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Bernard taught English at Harvard. They had two sons, Gordon, an amateur writer, and Mark, a music theorist and composer. In 1832, Bernard published a well-received work of history and criticism, Mark Twain's America. I won't go through the reviews, but at any rate, from 1932 to 38, and from time to time thereafter, DeVoto was a regular staff member of the Bread Wolf Writers Conference for 2 weeks every summer. He became editor of Harper's Easy Chair column in 1935, and often, this is where he can pronounce and pontificate all kinds of things. His controversial pronouncements on politics, education, literature, automobile travel, and the perfect martini, among other topics, appeared monthly until 1955. This is Avis. In addition to being an accomplished cook and book reviewer, Avis DeVoto worked for many years as Bernard's secretary, handling his correspondence and editing his writing. She received a letter from Julia Child in 1952 when Julia read an article that Bernard had written about knives. And actually the article was a tirade against capitalism and the production of inferior knives, et cetera, et cetera. And Julia Child read this and was so intrigued with it that she wrote Bernard a letter. But Amos is the person who answered the letter, and they became fast friends. And their letters are a book. Between 1943 and 1953, Bernard DeVoto wrote the trilogy that documented the history of the West, including The Way of Decision, Across the Line of Missouri, for which he won the Pulitzer, and of course of Empire, for which he won the National Book Award. Let's see, I'm going to run out of time here. So here's Bernard with one of his sons. He dies of a aneurysm in 1955 while he was destined, he was supposed to appear on a television program. He was 58 years old. His ashes are scattered from an airplane over the Clearwater National Forest. While DeVoto was following the route taken by Lewis and Clark and writing his book, The Lewis and Clark Journals, he camped in this area and had fallen in love with it. He wanted his ashes scattered. This task was given to Chet Olsen, his friend. Actually, this is Bernard. And he was taking a flight in a Forest Service airplane. Chet Olsen becomes very important to Bernard. We have to remember that Ogden was a center for national forest. The region 8 of the national forest is centered in Ogden. DeVoto had many friends, and it was not long before they looked for a suitable memorial for him. This is the issue that captures his attention, however, and is the reason for his last very provocative essays. When he comes to find out that there's a plot effort to dam rivers in the Dinosaur National Monument. And had this gone through, it would have doomed all of the national parks, the national monuments. They would have been available for development, et cetera, et cetera. So he gets his friends together. He rouses the public by writing all kinds of essays. And he actually succeeds in blocking this situation. I do want to close with this plaque. And who's been to the DeVoto Memorial? Yes, okay, all of you. This is a great field trip. You should all go. Amos's ashes are scattered there also. And it really came about because of Chet Olsen. This longtime friendship with this Forest Service agent resulted in, well, they were going to name the forest after it, but after DeVoto, but Idaho residents objected. So they just named this small portion of it. Thank you very much.
Professor Burrows. She should be changing the slides.
As you saw just a minute ago, I took instruction in this damned invention and got it wrong. And so bear with me when we move on to fiction and the exposition. My name is Russell Burrows. I'm very pleased to be here. I may have the hard assignment. The conference theme is water, and I come before you to talk about spirits. Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Just a quick word about how this assignment fell into my hands. With fiction, the exposition, DeVoto wrote 5 novels, none of which is really very good, in my opinion, but others have agreed with me. He's written a lot of exposition. Some of it lives pretty well, some of it's obscure. In my search for a topic, I hit upon the slim volume of only about 100 pages that I think lives largest in DeVoto's exposition. And that is a volume he entitled The Hour, by which he meant the cocktail hour. That's what I meant by spirit. So here in Utah County and in the Marriott Hotel, I propose to talk about alcohol. And I've reproduced the cover of this, the volumes illustrated, which I thought would be a great segue into talking a little bit about how DeVoto put this book together. And of course, my invitation, if you're looking for a good, vigorous piece of writing, my recommendation is The Hour. That might be a great place to start. Just a moment ago, I said that it's taken on new life, and that's because a regional press, it's called a Tin House in Portland, Oregon, has got the option of this and has been publishing and selling The Hour and doing quite well with it. The proprietor up there, the publishers, a guy by the name of Will McCormick, was a big deal in Democratic politics in the state of Oregon, clear back to the days of Gary Hart, but also on through Barack Obama. And the Tin House press has been selling this thing, and it's been generating some very lively reviews that you can look up if you want to go to Amazon. And with that introduction, here we go. The contents. We started a section on the American spirits. The second for the wayward and the beguiled. This is for people who don't understand how to drink like gentlemen. The third section, the enemy. If you know anything about DeVoto's personality, he collected enemies like some kids collect baseball cards. I think he reveled in enemies sometimes. He understood that there were enemies out there. And I brought an illustration of this is a this is my graphic aid, the enemy. Comprised of all those who dared to put fruit juices into cocktails. And finally, The Hour. That would be the cocktail hour. One of the illustrations, DeVoto went back to the founding of the nation and decided it was part and parcel with alcohol, especially whiskey. Bourbon or rye became DeVoto's favorite drinks. And one thing I'd like to say about this heritage is a guy by the name of Mike Rowe, who does the Dirty Jobs series on television, has a splendid PBS series on the role that alcohol played in the founding of the nation, and that's where DeVoto started his book. First page, this will give you a taste of DeVoto's prose style. DeVoto is an acquired taste, like some whiskeys I've fooled around with. Are we going for time? Five, okay. DeVoto, he got into the cadence of the pulpit, the church pulpit. And that's because I think he'd grown up so much on the Bible. He began, we are a pious people, but a problem too, a rare and noble lineage and a great inheritance. Let us candidly admit that there are shameful blemishes on the American past, of which by far the worst is rum. That touches very lightly on the first transatlantic trade, rum out of New England, slave catching on the west coast of Africa, and the production, the growing of sugarcane in the Caribbean. That was, and DeVoto drove that point home later in his. I heard Massasoit has had a part on the conference. This is Massasoit. We're back to that. I need to catch up. This is the line I have prepared to go with this. Concede that the Indians had ingenuity, and by means of it achieved a marvel. They took a couple of wild grasses and bred them up to corn. But what did they do with corn? The rhetorical question is exactly nothing. The age of stone, the age of polished stone forever, or the stars. And DeVoto's style of that, he would bring things together in startling effect. The stars, which I thought was an awfully well chosen term, stars, in terms of the a good buzz on from a good drink, or hangover. There we go. DeVoto gets a little bit technical. in the production and the flavoring of alcohol. This is the chemist. You'll see fusel oil there. Now, don't get the idea I'm a great authority on my subject. I just am amused by it, mostly amused by DeVoto's writing style. Fusel oil, as I understand it, is a byproduct of fermentation, which the distillers decide to put back into whiskeys of various sorts. Fusel oil, potassium acetate, sulfuric acid, all of these goes into the flavoring of whiskey. Makes me think that my grandmother was right when she told me to lay off the stuff. There's that potassium acetate, in addition to a food additive, also shows up in de-icing agents for airplanes and fire extinguishers. This is DeVoto bragging a little bit about her heritage. He said the English fresh off the boat would hustle to the American bar at the Astor House in St. Nicholas. The Englishman tour made by hackney coach from the boat so that the magnificence of the New World could burst on him in his first hour. You recognize the bathtub gin. DeVoto had a few things to say about. Okay, here we go. Notice the background. Now notice all the fruits. It's a big process. Why I brought the orange juice. Even at the table at the banquet, one of our number leaned over and asked if there might be a little something we could slip into the orange juice to get him through the afternoon. DeVoto was against it. We got off a really funny section. Cookbooks, Julie Child excelled cookbooks. DeVoto insisted that nobody had changed a recipe in an American cookbook for generations, and most of them are wrong. And it's maybe a note of chauvinism in that expression the guy wears, but she means to do well. He's skeptical. Lest you become alarmed, DeVoto was against drunkenness. This is the caricature, the excesses of American drinking habits. Daniel Pisen would be one. Danger men drinking, danger hangover under construction, danger check your moles, and finally, how dry I am. DeVoto very much opposed drinking to excess. This last slide is the last part of the book. It's called the hour. This is the cocktail hour. And DeVoto's fervent wish on behalf of gentlemen and lady drinkers everywhere is that may 6 o'clock never find you alone. Thank you.
Sir David. Next. So I'm going to talk about DeVoto as historian. I'm going to stake out the proposition argumentatively that nearly everything that DeVoto writes is history, or it's informed or grounded in history, particularly the history and geography of the American West. As Greg Smoke would say, that's a provocative statement, but that is, and as Kathryn said, that's what DeVoto did. He intended to provoke, create an argument, and that's where he was at his greatest as a writer and a thinker. From his earliest novels to the hundreds of essays he wrote in the greatest periodicals of his age, DeVoto handed his readers an argument and a small history lesson in almost every one of them. His interest in history can't be separated from his birthplace. It's all about Ogden. He absorbed and then regurgitated that history in his earliest novels, The Crooked Mile, in Ogden, The Underwriters of Salvation, and then more largely in his American Mercury article called Utah, which if you haven't read it, that's the thing of DeVoto's to read. Each is historically situated and argued. each educates like a 45 caliber slug to the back of the head. To quote DeVoto, well, it didn't work. No point in putting a silencer on the gun when you shoot the sheriff. DeVoto, as literary historian, emerged when he wrote Mark Twain's America in 1932, where he rescues Twain's reputation from literary critics of the time who poo-pooed him as a minor regional figure. DeVoto takes him and says, this is his historic context. This is why he's essential in our literary canon. As editor of Harper's Easy Chair column, a monthly column, he doubled down on history, becoming ultimately the intellectual interpreter for American and Western history for the nation. Whether the column was literary, political, socioeconomic, cultural, or environmental, a small history lesson, again, informs nearly everyone and grounds his judgment. Even in that 1951, again, the best thing I think well, I'm not going to say that. One of his greatest pieces, The Hour, about the cocktail hour, it's history. He starts, let us candidly admit that there are shameful blemishes on the American past, by which by far the worst is rum. Nevertheless, we improved man's lot and enriched his civilization with rye, bourbon, and the martini cocktail. In all history has any nation done so much. Right here, in 50 words, under 50 words, DeVoto encapsulates American alcoholic history. He misses Applejack, but that's okay. That doesn't really count. He nails rum, which is colonialism and slavery. Rye whiskey, which is the whiskey rebellion. Bourbon, which is commercial agriculture. And then gin, the cultural prohibition to post-World War II civilization. But does include in history, in all of these things he wrote, that aren't specifically histories, doesn't make him a historian. Well, Stegner addressed this. He concluded that DeVoto really didn't want to be a historian. He was a literary artist, a quote, writer, by which he meant a novelist, and that he became an acclaimed historian by serendipity, quote, by the kind of inevitability that takes advantage of accidents. He was, said Stegner, quote, a kind of historian, many historians wish they could be, and others would not be if they could. And DeVoto himself never considered himself a historian, a professional historian. He said, quote, I'm a literary department store. I'm a journalist, a mere literary gent who can be a nice press agent for history. And he approached history from that perspective. He, like other professionals of his day and now, criticized professional historians for writing dense, plodding monographs for nobody else but other people in the academy, not for a broader public. Yet DeVoto saw the utility in those boring monographs in the right hands, in his hands. And this was his method. He would take that material, synthesize the work of professional historians, while conducting his own primary research. He would select colorful stories, arrange the presentation of facts in an engaging manner, and then offer readers a synthesis, the big so what, an interpretive value judgment, which historians get nervous about. Writing fiction taught DeVoto how to construct good history, tell an individual story, build drama, swing for the fences. And that's what he does. Between 1943 and 1952, DeVoto produces one of the most heralded trilogies in all of American history. The Year of Decision, 1946, about a single year in the most, and the culminating impact of Western migration on a nation inevitably headed to civil war. He then steps back in time with his next book, Across the Wide Missouri, Pulitzer and Bancroft winning award, stepping back in time to examine the fur trade that precedes migration. And then finally, in The Course of Empire, his sweeping National Book Award winner, where he steps back in time yet again to synthesize hundreds of years of European and American history of imperialism up to Lewis and Clark. These are really dense histories. Anybody read any of these? They're dated, But there, and as Russ has indicated, sometimes the prose is really difficult. That's DeVoto. But what he did is use literary conventions to organize and enliven them. Again, he synthesized. Secondly, he looked for a compelling event or individual through which he could tell a factual story symbolizing the entire movement. Stegner called this synecdoche. Lost my place. Finding the part that represents the whole and then creating a universe of meaning around that small episode. And finally, instead of plodding along chronologically or topically, DeVoto employed simultaneity, telling a series of episodic stories, jumping back and forth in time and space to capture the interconnected nature of all of those events happening at once. Now, if you've ever read a history book like that, that's very hard to keep in your head, because you're remembering you're trying to put together these stories, not in a straight chronological order, but move them back together. And it required a lot of his readers, but it worked. Amazingly popular. It was even popular among historians, even though they complained about a missing detail here or there. As for history itself, DeVoto is ultimately the iconoclastic, pugilistic, contrarian who mirrored and muddled all of the interpretive trends of his age, the historiography, and made it his own. He insisted on facts over theory, storytelling, and synthesis over excessive detail, the value of judgment over the noble dream of objectivity, that history had to serve a contemporary purpose. It had to do something. He was a Turnerian, Frederick Jackson Turner, seeing the rise of nationalism in Western, but he eschewed Turner's rugged individualism and power. He eschewed rugged individualism for power of the group and the role of the federal government in particular. Utah taught him this lesson, that individualists, Western individualists, usually ended up at the end of a rope held by cooperationists. He embraced manifest destiny as socially and politically inevitable rather than divinely ordained. DeVoto argued that Western created American continental mind at the very moment that Perry Miller is doing just the opposite thing, talking about the New England mind of 17th century Puritanism. He was a product of our lands. DeVoto then saw a connection with Walter Prescott Webb and his geographic and environmental determinism, yet he denied steadfastly his determinism or any determinism for what he saw as instead historical inevitability. History, he said, abhors determinism, but cannot tolerate chance. That always boggles my mind. DeVoto also, though at heart, was an early social historian, especially into the 1950s, as social history was exploding worldwide. He cared about ordinary individuals. He cared about lived and everyday life, how people did things, lived experience. His history, he highlighted the roles of women, Hispanics, Indians, even Mormons. And yet at the same time, he was dismissive of all of those groups, especially in the face of what he saw as an inevitably expanding American nation. And so I think that's where I'm going to conclude, that DeVoto, as a historian, is a man of his time. He practiced history as an art rather than as a science. His histories reflect both his intellectual inconsistencies and the historiographic contexts and biases of race, class, and gender in his generation. It's a reminder to all of us that given enough time and knowledge, looking back 50, 60, 70 years, all of our histories will reflect our moment and fall short of our future. Thank you.
Can I have the next batch, please? Look at you. Way ahead. Thank you. I'm Jeff Nichols from Westminster, and my subject is Bernard DeVoto as a conservationist, which may be what he is best remembered as. David has suggested that DeVoto's writing is always historical. I would point out that most of his writing after a certain date, as we'll talk about, is about the land, and it certainly is informed by history. By mid-century, he was arguably the most important and influential conservationist, the word they would have used at the time, in the country. It's shaped somewhat by his birthplace, as we talked about, in Ogden in 1897. We heard from Kathryn a bit about his grandfather's farm. He watched his grandfather use water carefully in his orchard, and that gave him an appreciation for sustainable land management. He sees it, the risks and the successes of land management on a big scale around him. When DeVoto was 10 years old, Theodore Roosevelt created Wasatch National Forest. Young Bernard, who, as we heard, was sort of an odd, bookish outcast, spent lots of time hiking, camping, shooting guns there. May I have the next? Ooh, I've got the power to do so, don't I?
It's the top arrow. Oh, turn it around. Now go top arrow.
Really?
I can also just click it.
Okay. Yes, you need to see more photos of this odd-looking small man with a big brain. We've actually seen this one. So he did enjoy the outdoors, certainly. He went east to teach, write the great American novel, met and married Avis. In 1925, they visited Ogden, visited Bernard's father, and Bernard was horrified to see much of the forest and the high meadows he loved scalped by livestock. And as we heard, during World War I, there was a great demand for beef and wool and other products, which made the federal government lift grazing restrictions, and they had not been reinstated. Nate Schweber, who published recently This America of Ours, which I think several of us have used, writes that, quote, Utah was late in the stages of having its vegetative skin grafted off, close quote. The DeVoto's were camping in the mountain, nearly got caught in a massive flash flood, which was made worse by the lack of vegetation, holding the soil and water in place, and killed several people. Schweber suggests this was a really formative event for DeVoto. He's also, of course, this voracious reader of Western and American literature, of history, of the primary documents. That persuades him of the importance of what we would think of as the environment. He finally achieved some success, as we heard, in 1932 with Mark Twain's America. And in 1934, he published in Harper's an article called The West, a Plundered Province. And that phrase, plundered province, sort of catches on. He lays out some of the conservation, social, economic, and political themes that he'll riff on for the rest of his life. May I have the next one, please? One of the things that essay does, and we've seen this from Greg Smoke's presentation, is that Bernard DeVoto's West is John Wesley Powell's West. He very much accepts, hey, the West begins at the 100th meridian. Of course, you have to be going the right direction. The line west of which less than 20 inches of annual rainfall. He also draws on Walter Prescott Webb's The Great Plains, which had just been published a couple years before. Both Powell and Webb emphasized that the Western environment was so different from the East that it demanded different institutions, practices, technology than did settling the East. And DeVoto would write that stupid, his word, stupid Congress never passed a single land law that fit the West. His main focus in this essay is how Eastern industrial and financial interests have controlled the exploitation of Western resources. Give you a sense of the words here, quote, the few alpine forests of the West were leveled, its minerals were mined and smelted. All its resources were drained off through perfectly engineered gutters of a system designed to flow eastward. It may be empire building, the Westerner may be excused if it is looked to him like simple plunder, close quote. And DeVoto agreed with Powell and Webb that nature, aridity especially, had imposed limits on what some call the American dream, unbridled growth of individual wealth. He hints at the end of plundered province that only collective action and cooperation has successfully allowed people to make a living in the West. Harper's evidently liked the article, the reaction to it so well, they offered him the easy chair column the next year. This is a column that had been around since 1851, widely considered the most influential opinion piece in some ways among the intellectual leadership of the country. It's read by Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, not a lot of them, but some of them. But he still wants to be a novelist. And now he's a historian. In 1942, he publishes The Year of Decision, big popular hit, among other things, and it gives him more gravitas. It gives him more influence. In 1946, he was on vacation with his family and overheard what he describes as a very drunken stockman in Miles City, Montana, talking about big changes coming to public lands. And DeVoto's instincts as a journalist made him listen, said, I need to find out about this. In Boise, may I have the next one, please? He met this man, another terrible photograph, but anyway, this is Chet Olsen, with the Forest Service in Ogden. Olsen managed to get DeVoto the resolutions of a recent meeting of sheep and cattlemen's associations, representatives of the biggest ranchers in the West, who had met with state officials in Salt Lake City and to concoct, to further a plan to use their contacts in Congress to pass legislation to get the public lands turned over to the states. DeVoto was sure the states would then sell them off, they would be exploited and ruined. You have the next one, please. The congressional effort that would, of course, affect these very large numbers of public lands in the West. May I have the next? This congressional effort is led mostly by the Nevada Senator, Patrick McCarran. I think there's wonderful symmetry. It was Nevada Senator William Stewart, who eventually turned on John Wesley Powell. McCarran is one of his descendants in a similar seat. McCarran had successfully attacked the Taylor Act's grazing surface by simply cutting its appropriations. Now he's going after the new Bureau of Land Management. Chet Olsen got Bernard DeVoto the evidence he needed. DeVoto kept it secret for his whole life, but he got very strategic about how he was going to write about it. He times his articles so that they will appear on a newsstand with the congressional calendar. The January 1947 issue of Harper's, he writes an article called The West Against Itself. Goes to his editor, asks for it, gets double space for this. That's how much the editor trusted him. At the time, Harper's circulation was about 144,000, far from being a mass market magazine, but it's widely read. And he argues that the stockmen want to convert what they already had, the subsidized privilege of cheap permit grazing on public lands, into a vested property right. If they got all the legislation passed, they would get the former Taylor Act grazing lands removed from BLM control, a couple of 100 million acres, given to the states. All grazing land would also be surveyed and removed from the Forest Service and distributed to states. One proposed bill would even survey for grazing all public lands, including national parks, for the same sort of process. If it all passed, abolition of the BLM, limitation of the Forest Service to forests, great amputation of the national parks, and an enormous loss of the public lands overall. And he calls it land grab, usually one word, land grab, sometimes two. A useful and flexible term. We probably all remember Orrin Hatch using that term to refer to denounce Bill Clinton's creation of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in 1996, flexible term. DeVoto puts it in context. He says, it's in the same continuity of Western plunderers since the West was settled by whites. And he claims that the stock business has, quote, done more damage to the West than any other, and that only the big ranchers would benefit, the small ranchers still relying on public land permits would fail. And he praises New Deal programs. That's what's different from 1934 plundered province, is by 1947, there are New Deal programs to, quote, rehabilitate depleted resources, halt and repair erosion, rebuild soil, restore areas of social decay. He sees his friend, Chet Olsen, and what he had done with CCC crews in the mountains above Ogden, that were not damaged by flash floods like other places were. He wins. DeVoto wins this time. No legislation passes. There was too much opposition. The idea keeps coming back. I heard Bill McKibben once say that, bad ideas never die. They just keep getting recycled. This is the first of 40 articles about the West that Bernard DeVoto would publish and write over the next 9 years. But this is the one that really cements his influence. When he wins the Pulitzer and the Bancroft, he's got even more influence. He becomes a public lands and Western advisor to candidate Adlai Stevenson, and he continued fighting the public lands fight until his death in 1955 in the face of blacklisting, anti-communist, McCarthyite red baiting. But he won his aspect of it. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I don't have slides, so I can just jump right in. My role in this panel today is to infuse a bit more water into the discussion, sort of in keeping with our theme of the conference. We've heard a little bit about that, but I would say at the outset, to the extent that DeVoto infused history in all of his writings, I'd say the central force in those writings, especially pertaining to the West, from my observation, would be an argument could be made there's water. Although I haven't read his full corpus, I would say that water was a driving force as what he saw as in the progress or the march of human history. And so I think it's appropriate for me to start at least with an outline of something that Kathryn mentioned, his role in Echo Park Dam, the dam controversy and stopping that proposed dam of the powerful Bureau of Reclamation that conservationists and really the public at large railed against for flooding a particularly beautiful section of the Green and Yampa Rivers in Dinosaur National Monument. So this proposed dam was part of the Colorado River Storage Project, which was a massive kind of remaking of the Colorado system. 6 major dams would have coursed along the main stem or tributaries of the Colorado River and dozens of irrigation infrastructure developments. The idea was that the upper basin states then would use their fair share of water that had been sort of allocated to them under the 1922 compact on the Colorado River. And Utahns apparently in upper basin states united behind this proposal, thinking they had a right to develop their own resources. It was a benefit to the nation if they grew alfalfa. And they insisted on federal assistance to make this happen. And so in some ways, the issue largely coalesced between Westerners and Easterners, Westerners who supported these projects, Easterners who objected to their high costs and damage to the lands that they argued belonged to the American people. Now, DeVoto didn't object whole cloth to the idea of large waterworks, but he did rail against wrong-headed proposals from lawmakers and engineers that twisted facts and data, and against the ignorance of Westerners who thought dams would actually create water in the dry, arid West. And especially the objection was, as was pointed out, was that the specter of a dam in Echo Park and Dinosaur National Monument would spell doom to other national parks as well. And in fact, as part of CRISP, but also as part of a larger program of dam development at mid-century, the Bureau of Reclamation was considering dams in places like Glacier National Park, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone. And so DeVoto got involved because he thought, probably correctly, that this would set a precedent and it would open the way for dams to be built in other national parks and monuments. So as we know, he was the columnist in the Easy Chair since 1935, and he reached a large audience through that venue, but of course, he wanted an even broader audience. So while Jeff had referenced his piece, The West Against Itself, which was a blockbuster in and of itself, DeVoto's sort of salvo in this fight was published in the Saturday Evening Post in July 1950 that really introduced the public to these proposed developments that he thought would, as he titled his piece, "Shall we let them ruin our national parks?"
And so he argued that where before threats to the parks came from private interests interested in exploiting timber or mineral resources, now it was public federal agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers that exerted the greatest threats. Quote, do you want these wild splendors kept intact for your kids to see? Then watch out for the Army engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, because right where the scenery is, that's where they want to build their dams. I mean, he thought the dams entirely unnecessary. No Western state should receive any benefit or would receive any benefit from the construction of these dams inside the monument that could not be ensured by alternative construction outside it, he wrote. And so there's a lot more to say, I suppose, about his role in this Echo Park dam. And eventually the dam, of course, was a major victory for the conservationists. And his biographers, Schweber and Stegner have documented his position and how, in fact, his position on this particular front closed the door to him to publish in certain outlets. And it brought ever-increasing surveillance from the FBI and McCarthy allies, and it really impacted his well-being. The Salt Lake Tribune apparently denounced him and said that he was no longer welcome or safe in Utah. So DeVoto plays the central but probably largely unrecognized role in preventing Echo Park. What I really wanted to say is a few words, my reflections, having not read his full corpus of writing, but his biographies, as well as his letters and selected writings, a few words about his views of water, about water in the West. DeVoto read water on the landscape. To him, water consisted of the stuff of history. Where it flowed, there movement and settlement followed. He spoke of geographical factors in determining the march of westward migrants, passage over the continental divide, where people congregated and settled, and so forth. In a 1949 publication called Women's Day, he wrote, quote, if war comes, a basic reason will be that mankind has let too much water flow downhill too fast. His argument was that flowing water leaves farmland destroyed, or high erosion, flowing water and eroding the land would destroy farmland and pushes people to live on smaller and poorer areas of cropland. He went so far to say that rapidly flowing water strips topsoil of its nutrients. When that happens, he says it diminishes our own vigor, our resistance to disease, our body's ability to build sound bone and healthy blood. So he attributed this problem of water in the West, and specifically erosion of the landscape, to be a big problem in many ways. And so he wrote about this fundamental connection between water and land. And so in a sense, his conservation ethic, I would argue, begins with water, which he says is comparably more important than all other natural resources in the West put together. He called water supply and conservation the master condition of life in the West. And that, he said, was possible through the preservation of watersheds held intact through federal control of public lands. If you divest the federal government of its public lands, then you ruin the watersheds, he argued. Then water supply declines and settlement and growth in the West is not possible. And so I found it interesting. I attended a talk of Nate Schweber last night, in which the new biographer, he spoke of DeVoto. Whenever he was out on the public lands, he got down on his knees to evaluate the grasses to determine the state of the rangeland due to grazing. So again, this deep connection between land and water courses through much of the writings of DeVoto on conservation. In true DeVoto fashion, his writings not only pointed to the problem, but he volunteered solutions, like terracing the hills to capture water, planting cover crops and crops naturally adapted to the region, reverting land back to forests or wetlands. And so I think that his well-known railings against Echo Park Dam must be seen in this light, recognizing the necessity to save water. Perhaps more than anyone, he scrutinized these ill-conceived water development schemes. And I think that it was a sense of and knowledge of history, his familiarity with the Western landscapes, and indeed his own identity. And as he lived in the East, he identified, I think, as a Westerner to a great degree, that made his critique so powerful. Just to sort of close, Jeff talked a little bit, and Kathryn, about his life and his early experiences, a little bit with water. Of course, he grew up in Ogden. He was familiar with irrigation systems. I like to imagine him walking up in the foothills of the Wasatch Mountain and looking down on the Great Salt Lake. And I like to think about what that did to his mind and thinking in terms of the land and conservation. And of course, this 1925 episode in which the cabin was destroyed, that he was staying with his wife, and the impact that had on his conservation efforts down the road. And of course, what Jeff also pointed out is that DeVoto's perspectives on conservation and water very much aligned with Powell's. And so one place to start would be the introduction that he provided in Wallace Stegner's biography on John Wesley Powell, where he lays out his perspective on water and conservation in a really clear and compelling way. So it seems to me that we can take a page from DeVoto in our devotion, understanding, and loyalty to this region that we all are a part of and that we love. Furthermore, that we pay attention to water and its use and development here. Part of what makes DeVoto's writing so timeless is that conservation and water in particular will always be issues that we face and must contend with. So, thank you.
Thank you, panel. That was an excellent exercise in a full treatment of Bernard DeVoto in 60+ minutes. Would somebody bring the mic that's in the holder there above you, Glenda, to the front? We have purposely left.
Wired.
Is it hot or dead?
Well, you can take one of these.
Okay, we'll just put it in here. So we put this together so there was plenty of time for questions from you. And I'd like to compliment the panel for an extraordinary effort and exercise in reviewing in such short time the life of DeVoto. Amazing. I've been hanging around with so many DeVoto lectures the last few weeks. I'm dreaming of DeVoto, and your panelists did a wonderful job. So is there a question from the audience? I'll just walk this around.
Jeff, you seem to have found more material on Charleston than I did when I worked on the history of Region 4 of the Forest Service. Where did you find those documents?
Oh, I did not find the documents. Nate Schweber has gotten into those documents. So I'm citing Schweber's secondary work. There's a Chet Olsen collection at Utah State, if I'm not mistaken.
Weber College.
I'm sorry, Weber State.
Yeah, I went through that collection. Yeah.
Yeah, my stuff is from Schweber.
Okay, thank you.
So, Tom, I think the other part of Chet's material is in DeVoto's papers correct, at Stanford. Yeah. So I think the other part is there. DeVoto also destroyed a lot of that correspondence with all of the Forest Service people. He was being fed all of this information by Forest Service people on the ground, whose careers were under threat by Senator Pat McCarran and then Joe McCarthy, who was McCarran's protege, really. And so DeVoto and Avis in particular destroyed a lot of those papers when they were submitted.
Yes.
Hi, thank you all. I have so many questions and I want to ask them all, but I'm going to start with just this one and give other people a chance. So I kind of have two, and it's more geared towards Jed, but I know I'm going to kind of cover a little bit, and you may have kind of answered this too, but so it's two. Why did Bernard seem to focus on the Echo Park Dam so much, even though he kind of disowned Utah in his hometown? And second, did he ever do this with other dams around the US?
Yeah, so good questions, and the real biographers of DeVoto in this panel can talk about his relationship more to Utah. He had probably a conflicting relationship to Utah specifically. He wrote this really quite controversial article. It was not well received in Utah in the early 1920s. So there's more that others can say about that. And so but what's striking about looking at his life and his writings is he always gravitated toward the West. Avis was on a trip in Europe during this Echo Park controversy and lamenting that he could never get his husband to travel overseas with him because DeVoto's heart was in the West, and if there were places in the West that he hadn't seen, he was gonna spend his time there. And so I think that it's quite interesting to see him always returning back to these. He lived, breathed, dreamed, thought about the West in really profound ways. And so I think that he always identified himself such as a Utahn, as a Westerner. Now, folks can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but his writings are infused with this love of the region. And so he saw the West as his natal home, and indeed it was. And I feel like he spent his life, especially his final years, really trying to infuse this sense of conservation ethic in everything that he did. I ran across some quotes where he spoke quite sharply to Mike Mansfield, for example, in Montana, who in correcting him on the figures that Senator Mansfield was presenting about a dam in Glacier National Park. And so there, DeVoto was always ready to jump on ill-conceived projects, and kind of he was armed with all the facts and figures that he needed to make his arguments. Incredible mind.
And just to add to that about other dams, he was horrified to see the indigenous people that were going to be displaced from the best lands at Fort Berthold by the Garrison Dam, so he just thought from a social justice standpoint, that was awful. Real quick, I think on his relationship to Utah, some of the stuff he writes that's funnier than hell. Underwriters of Salvation in Ogden. He's writing those in the 1920s for H.L. Mencken at the American Mercury. So he's sort of putting on his Mencken hat that everything is to be made fun of.
And I'll add just one more thing. I think the real reason, and Kathryn mentioned this in passing, the way he comes to this Echo Park Dam is really through his activity on, is it the National Parks Advisory Board?
Exactly.
That's where he really comes in, because his concern is that if you strip the grazing service, then the sheepmen will be in charge. If you strip the Forest Service, then the grazers will be in charge. And the national parks are next. And so his advocacy for national parks really informs everything else he does about those dams and goes after them and public lands.
No, his presence on the National Parks Association was part and parcel of all of his advocacy, and he gets on that board in 46, I think, is the and so his issue is public lands. That's the issue for him, and he wants them to remain in public hands, whether they are forest lands, whether they are national monuments, whether they are national parks, whether they are BLM. He wants them in public hands because he figures that the larger public will deal with them more equitably, more fairly, less radical solutions. But remember that the National Park Service has as its mission to protect and preserve. And DeVoto was very keen with that idea.
Russell, comment? Oh, I'm going to pick up on Jeff's endorsement of those two essays, Utah and Ogden, the Underwriters of Salvation. There's a term I've enjoyed for several years called spread eagle invective. And that's those two essays. They are, if you ever want somebody to go after Utah culture, go read DeVoto when he was young. It's a wonder to behold.
Additional question. Go ahead, if it's on.
Hello? Yes. Sorry to make you relocate. Hi, something that I'm really interested in is the way that the history profession has gotten harder and harder to penetrate into, with like you need more and more qualifications and more training. And even with like being a public historian today, it's like you got to have at least like a master's in museum studies or history or whatever. And just getting back to this idea of public history, obviously we're combining the history conference this year with Utah museums because it's getting so trendy now to be an academic who also works with the public. It's almost like you have to do it. You can't just be a historian anymore. And getting to David's presentation, I think it's really interesting that he was kind of like a historian, but he was also a journalist, a conservationist. And I guess my question for you all is, now that we have this new field of public history, what do you think DeVoto would have thought about it? And do you think he would have identified himself as a public historian?
No.
No.
DeVoto always prided himself as being an essay. He always prided himself as being a writer. And he had aspirations, and then he's writing these terrible novels. He's writing under pseudonyms, other terrible writings, but always it is about writing. And again, he becomes a great writer because he was a great reader in his youth. He read voraciously. Was reading everything in the Carnegie Public Library in Ogden, reading all these books that his father brought home. So he is at his core a writer, but the writing encompasses history, geography, all kinds of issues.
Yes, of course, you would have loved public history. Well, I mean, this is DeVoto in his essence. This is a man who said something like the worst part about writing something down, or the best part about writing something down is you can change your mind later and rewrite it. He believed firmly in the uses of history for contemporary stuff. He believed that history needed to reach the people. I don't know what he said about museums that way, or that kind of stuff, but definitely written histories to reach the people. But at the same time, he's quite the elitist in his own world, as a conservationist or as a writer, as an intellectual. He is condescending to the nth degree, even when he's wrong. So you've heard a no and a yes, maybe.
I don't think he would call himself a public historian, but he would love the public history, as David and Kathryn have both suggested. When he collected a bunch of his major conservation essays in the easy chair in a volume, he called the section that was all the conservation ones something like a treatise on a function of journalism. I think that's how he collected them. It's definitely said a function of journalism. He saw himself as an investigative journalist in that work.
One of the hallmarks of public history is that the historian is not driving the questions, the public is. And what strikes me about DeVoto is he's out and about conversing with folks on the land, the rangers, the conservationists, the ranchers. He is talking to people, and that's exactly what public historians do. The other thing that actually is, I think it goes unnoticed, you really don't have public involvement in environmental planning until the late 1960s, and really with NEPA. And so what you find in DeVoto's writings and letters is like this heavy, he's almost thinking about I mean, he's like thinking of in the future about a time when there has to be a better process for the public to be able to register its comments and complaints and be a part of the public planning process in conservation issues and public lands issues. And that to me strikes, I mean, it's not public history per se, but it's very much in line with his thinking about the public needs to be involved in this sort of stuff.
But jumping off of that, Jed, it's really interesting that he's railing against federal management policies, but not necessarily public lands. So it's really common for Utah to be railing against federal land management policies. He's doing it from a conservation standpoint. And I wonder if he was specifically against individuals, agencies within the federal government, or federal government as a whole.
I think he saw people like McCarran and others who were representatives of big interest, big money, that they were manipulating federal policy to exploit those public lands. He wanted the public lands not quite left alone. He understood the need for timber and things like that, I think. But yeah, he didn't want them exploited by private interests that were actually working for the big guys.
I mean, at heart, he's a socialist. And he will praise socialists. In fact, there's a very famous quote of his after World War I. He says, well, now we can let the socialists and conscientious objectors out of jail. But the socialism has to do, again, with the public lands, that these are everybody's lands. And that's the ethos that he brings to this argument.
I'm gonna change the topic here. This is for Russell, actually. Did he actually illustrate the hour, or was it commissioned? And if he did illustrate it, are there any other illustrated works of him?
I don't know. I don't know who illustrated the. I have not found any other publications with DeVoto's illustrations in them. I suspect that he didn't. It was a publication of Houghton Mifflin, so it might have been the in-house art department that did it.
Russ, where was it originally published, or how? You know this part.
Houghton Mifflin did it. That
Wasn't it serialized?
I don't know about that. I think he wrote it. He brought it out in 51. Wouldn't surprise me if he tried it out as a magazine article. It does an immense number. His bibliography runs to 30, 40 pages. It's just overwhelming to look at how productive he was.
Thank you.
Scott, do you know that question? Did he serialize that?
I believe at least portions of it were published in magazines before.
And then collected.
I've never read anything that Bernard DeVoto has written. If you were recommending something for a first-time reader, what would you recommend?
Well,
Other than the hour, I got that one down.
What are your tastes?
Pretty eclectic.
My favorite history is Across the Wide Missouri. It's about the year of decision, 1846, is a close second behind that one. I recommend those histories. I'd also recommend the sketch he did on his grandfather, The Life of Jonathan Dyer. I'm sorry, did everybody hear that? I had a slide prepared on this if I got that far, but this is a gorgeous sketch about his pioneer grandfather on his maternal side.
It was actually named Samuel Dye.
Yeah, there's changed the name slightly. But this is as sympathetic to Mormon pioneering as you will ever find. if I'd had time, I would have said, somebody in this audience must know of an anthology under preparation somewhere. And this piece deserves a wide airing. It's really good.
Any other comments from the panelists?
Well, I think his essays, again, they big mention of this, the Less the Plundered Past the Plundered Province is an excellent essay. And in many ways, it's still rings true. By the way, he was working on a history of the West, or a commentary on the West that he didn't finish at his death. And it was later published under the title The Western Paradox. And that includes the chapters that he was writing, but it also includes some of his essays. So I would recommend The Western Paradox as a collection of essays and materials by Bernard DeVoto.
Yeah, I would second Kathryn on collected essays. He really is best when he's an essayist, because an essay is all about an argument. And that's what DeVoto did. At the same time, I would second Russ with Across the Wide Missouri was the first piece of his that I read after the essay in American Mercury titled Utah. And Across the Wide Missouri is really a beautiful description in some ways, a hymn to the mountain, and it captured my attention when I was younger.
I would third the endorsement of collected essays, particularly the one he put together called The Easy Chair. But he's got, I believe, 3 other hardback compilations of some of his essays. I'll be heretical enough to say I don't particularly like him as a historian, but if I had to choose among them, it'd probably be The Year of Decision.
So I think another good entry into DeVoto would just be simply his letters. A huge collection. Some of those are published. The collection that I love, in addition to, well, the selected letters of Bernard DeVoto, edited by Wallace Stegner, and then his selected correspondence with Virginia Stearns, which the U of U Press has published. And so, I mean, really, you just get a lot of eclectic writings and perspectives there, and so it just seems to me to be a great way to kind of hear his voice outside of his formal publications.
This is a wonderful book. It's published by the U Press, and they have copies at their table in the exhibit area.
You can get it for about $13 a day with the discount.
Did y'all hear that? $13 with the discount? Where did I go here? I'm borrowing books of people. Anyone else comment?
Well, I was going to reply to the woman who asked about what to read. Oh, are you an iconoclast? Probably. Then I'd pick up DeVoto's editing job under the title of Mark Twain's Letters from the Earth. I think lots of young people ought to discover this in their own time, their own way. A quick introduction to the title. These are the letters written by the Archangel Satan, who's on the earth, back to the Archangel Michael, who's in heaven. The subject of the letters from the earth are what an absurdity is mankind who believes that God really cares.
For those of you who subscribe to Harper's, you have access to their digital archives, all 100 and whatever years it is, and you can go back and take a look by searching through his name and title of it. It's a fun exercise.
Quick question, kind of outside of water, but tangentially related. What exactly is the connection between Stegner and DeVoto? They always come together. Did they actually know each other in person? They're friends? Okay. I was probably the only one that didn't know that, but.
Actually, Stegner considered DeVoto his mentor. And they were very close. And Stegner and his wife, Barnard and his wife, all knew each other, spent time together, lots of time together.
Yes, DeVoto was at Harvard when Stegner got there, and they looked one another up at the Utah connection. They became friends. They became collaborators in many respects, and later Stegner wrote an excellent biography on DeVoto under the title of The Uneasy Chair, which is a knockoff of The Easy Chair in Harper's. And in my estimation, that's one of the finest biographies you'll ever read.
That biography, Stegner promised Avis he would not include her and the family in the biography. And Stegner was true to his word. It makes you wonder a little bit when you read it, but recently, as the panelists have been referring to, Nate Schreiber has just published, July 22, The America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto at the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. I highly recommend this. It's a wonderful read. It includes Avis and their two sons. This book reveals a part of Western history that is dark, ugly, and brutal, and is an amazing statement about it. Highly recommend it. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Anybody? Worn you out?
Just want to ask, where is his memorial?
It's,
So it is in the Clearwater National Forest. It is an hour and a half south west of Missoula. You head south down the Bitterroot Valley to Lolo, and then you turn west up Highway 12, up over Lolo Pass, Lewis and Clark. There's a grove just a mile or two on the other side, and it's in Idaho, actually, I believe. And it's a beautiful grove of cedars that go to the sky. And then the sign and the plaque that you saw. It's interesting, something about him on those tours, he got to that spot and tributary of the Lolo River right there, or the Lacha River right there. And he rhapsodized that this was a great place for somebody to spend eternity. And so his friend Chet Olsen, Avis and Chet Olsen ultimately did that for him, scattered him from a plane over the Bitterroot Mountains.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful hour and a half.